Good evening. Certainly good to see you this evening. Certainly glad that this is where you have chosen to be. The Lord certainly blessed us with a beautiful day. There's certainly many other things that you could be doing, but I, for one, am glad that you are here. And I truly mean that. I'm encouraged by your presence. I'm encouraged by your willingness to put God in His proper place by being assembled with the saints this evening. Tonight we're going to be doing a lesson in lyric. It's been a little bit since we've done one of these. I know for a fact we didn't do one last month. My kids seem to think we didn't do one the month before that, but I think we did. We may not have, I don't know. But I always enjoy the studies that we do in our lesson in lyrics. And tonight the song we're going to be examining is the song that we just sang, number 281 in our songbooks, Let the Lower Lights Be Burning. And you know, on the surface, it seems like this song could just simply be a song about a lighthouse. As a matter of fact, in its origins, I believe it simply started as just a poem. As a matter of fact, I believe it was Leah in her schooling this year had that as a poem that she actually had to study. But really, when you look at the song itself, when you consider the lyrics for just a moment, as we're going to do this evening, it's much more than just a mere poem, but has really a beautiful message that you and I can not only take to heart, but certainly one that we can tell others as well. Note verse 1 with me of this particular song. Brightly beams our Father's mercy from His lighthouse evermore. But to us He gives the keeping of the lights along the shore. You think about the Father, and I realize that we referenced some of these passages just earlier today in our previous sermon, but where else can you go when you talk about God being light, right? 1 John chapter 1, starting there in verse number 5, that God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. And as this particular song starts out, brightly beams our Father's mercy, brightly beams our Father's light from His lighthouse evermore. And you think about our Father and where He is at, right? Jesus would say in John chapter 14 and verse number 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man cometh to the Father except by me. And we understand that Jesus there in Acts chapter 7, even as Stephen is looking up into the clouds and he sees Jesus, where is Jesus at? On the right hand of the throne of God. And so we know that our Father is there in heaven, and He is letting His light shine from heaven. But it says brightly means our Father's mercy. Certainly when we talk about mercy, there's another word that always seems to go with it, and rightfully so. You really can't separate the idea of mercy from grace. And when we benefit from the mercy of God, we also benefit from His grace. You know, it is the case that sometimes we define mercy as not receiving what we deserve. God shows us mercy. Does He not display this in our lives? You think about what's read there, what's said there in Romans chapter number 3 and verse number 23, where it says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so all men, they're going to come to a point in their life where they understand the difference between right and wrong, when they understand the difference between God's will and their own will. And the first time that man's will and God's will doesn't come together, oftentimes what does man do? He chooses his own will and therefore sin. But then you read just a few chapters later in that same book in Romans chapter 6 and verse number 23, the wages of that sin is death. See, when you and I sin, when you and I miss the mark, when you and I go against the will of God, you know what it is that we deserve? It is the case that we deserve death. That has always been the penalty, even from the very beginning. What was it that God told Adam and Eve in the garden? The moment that you eat of this tree, when you eat of this tree, what is going to happen? Thou shalt surely die. Now we understand that Adam and Eve didn't die physically at that point in time in the garden, but they were driven from the garden, were they not? They lost access to the tree of life, did they not? And physical death would enter the scene. But you know, we find something interesting about death. You go over to James chapter 2 in verse number 26, and it says, let's just turn over there. James chapter 2 and verse number 26 is right there on the tip of my tongue, but I don't have the order correctly in my mind, and so there it's messing me up. James chapter 2 and verse number 26, whereas the body without the spirit or without the soul is dead, so faith without works is dead also. But notice what it says, the soul without the body without the soul is dead. And so when you think about death, in its simple definition, in a simple understanding of what death is, it is just simply, and I know it doesn't seem this way to us, but death is just simply a separation. When you think about physical death, it's the separation from the body and the soul. When you think about physical death, it's the separations from loved ones that are left here on this earth from the loved ones that have gone on. But now take that same idea, that same concept, and apply it to spiritual death. Spiritual death is a separation from God and man, as is illustrated there in Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. And so what you see happening then with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when they ate of that tree, when they sinned, they were now separated from God. And God, as we discussed this morning, would drive them from that garden. And so you and I, when we sin, we are separated from God. We deserve death. Not only do we deserve physical death, but if we don't get it right, you know what we deserve? Spiritual death. That's why the Hebrew writer is so important to say in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse number 27, for it is appointed unto man to die once, but after this the judgment. Man was never intended to die twice. It was never God's intention, really, when you think about it, for man to ever die. If God had it as part of the plan for man to die, why would He ever put the tree of life in the Garden of Eden? It wasn't a part of the plan for man to die. But God understood that man was going to mess his plan up. And so He had to have a plan for when man messed his plan up. And I'm not saying that man messed his plan up when Jesus came to the earth the first time and the Jews rejected Him, and so He had to go to plan B and establish the church. That's not what I'm talking about. But He had to have a plan to be able to bring mankind back to Him. And so you think about this song, right? Brightly beams our Father's mercy. Each and every day we are blessed with the mercy of God. Each and every day we are blessed with the grace of God. And aren't you thankful that we have those things? But you know, I get to thinking about the rest of that first part of that verse, right? But to us, He gives the keeping of the lights along the shore. And so here's the Father in heaven. He's beaming out this light. He's beaming out His mercy because He wants all men to be saved. He has done everything in His power for all men to be saved, right? We could sit here and we could quote passages all day long that prove the point that God has done everything in His power for mankind to be saved. But then He says, you know what? I want man to be saved. And there are going to be those that do what's necessary in order to be saved. And to those individuals, God says, I'm giving you the keeping of the lights along the shore. And you say, well, Zach, where does the Bible say that? Well, we've already referenced this a lot today. You know, it's interesting. As I study my individual sermons, I don't study, believe it or not, I don't study all three of them at the same time. Like I work on one, and then when it's finished, I go to the next one, and then when it's finished, I go to the next one as far as my Bible class and things. And so it just amazes me sometimes as I get up and preach, and it's like, oh wait, well I had that in this morning's sermon too. And so guess what? We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5. I know we've referenced this passage, I believe, not only in our adult Bible class this morning, but also in our lesson this morning. But here we go again. But you know what? It's all right, because it's the Word of God. Look there at Matthew chapter 5. I believe this morning we just referenced this passage. We never actually turned over here. But look there at Matthew chapter 5, and let's start there in verse number 14, where he says, "You are the light of the world. Ye are, you all." That's what Jesus is talking to. That's the beautiful thing about the King James there. When you see the word ye, it's really showing you all of you are the light of the world. The city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And so God has given you and I the responsibility of taking His mercy, taking His soul-saving message, and taking it into the world. You know, the truth of the matter is, and I know that this is really, when you think about it, sometimes it's sad to think about this, but the truth of the matter is, the majority of the people around us are lost. And someone may say, well, Zach, how could you say something like that? Well, don't take my word for it, but take Jesus's. If you're there in the Sermon on the Mount, move over towards the end there to Matthew chapter 7. And notice what Jesus himself would even say there in verse number 13, when he says, "Enter ye in the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And many there be which go in thereat, because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." The sad truth, the sad reality before us this evening is the majority of people are lost. So picture it this way. Here is God beaming out His light. He has the desire for all men to be saved. And He entrusts me and you to be lights here upon this earth so others can see, can hear that soul-saving message, right? Romans chapter 1 and verse number 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation." The gospel. Paul would talk there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 15 that the heart and soul of the gospel, if you will, is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The gospel, euangelizo, the good news. The good news is that yes, the majority of people in the world, they are dying, but they don't have to be. That's the good news. Because Jesus came to this earth, He showed forth the Father's mercy, and He went to the cross to make it possible for man to be saved. He made it possible for you and I to be saved. And so therefore, as His children, and as those claiming to be Christian, it is our responsibility to let our light shine, to bring others unto Him. Consider verse number 2 of this song. It says, "Dark the night as sin has settled, loud the angry billows roar. Eager eyes are watching, longing for the lights along the shore." You know, I think about this particular verse here, and I couldn't help but think about the scope of sin, or maybe a better way to put it, the reality of sin. Because the truth of the matter is, and I know we have discussed this before in previous sermons, but sin is nothing good. Although Satan paints it as something good, he tries to play it off as something good. Sin is not good at all. And here, as the song says, "Dark the night of sin has settled." And so here sin has settled in, because sin is darkness. Dark. Loud the angry billows roar. You know, I remember a preacher one time giving an illustration in a lesson. And he used to be in the military, the Navy, and he was working on an aircraft carrier. And it would be commonplace that they would do these blackout drills because, you know, maybe an enemy's near, and so they got to shut everything down and they've got to be dark. And he said, so they're out in the middle of the ocean one day, and he was out on the deck of this aircraft carrier, and they come up one of those drills. He said there was no moon. He said you couldn't see the stars because it was cloudy. And he said that aircraft carrier went dark. And he said, all I could think to do was just lie down because I didn't want to wander off the side of this big boat. And he said, as I'm laying there, he said, you could just hear the waves knocking up against that boat. And I sometimes picture that when singing this song, right? Dark the night as soon as settled, that it's dark and you can't see a way out, and you could hear the angry waves beating up against the side of the ship, and you know, for a moment, it almost seems hopeless. You know, just as we read earlier, or referenced earlier at least in 1 John chapter 5, that God is light. But notice there is no darkness in Him at all. Sin is often depicted as darkness. You can go there in John chapter 1 and verse number 5. Also 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5 as it turns out. But in 1 John, just the gospel record of John, chapter 1, verse number 5, start reading there and read down a little bit way about the light and how men rejected the light and want nothing to do with it. But you know, you can imagine, and as each of us have had to deal with sin, you know, it'd be real easy to become engulfed in sin, like the angry billows roar. But you know, then I think about the next part of that particular verse where it says, eager eyes are watching, longing for the light along the shore. You could just imagine being on a ship, and you know, I didn't really illustrate this. I just was under the assumption we understood how a lighthouse works. But, you know, ships and sailors, when they're coming in to sea, they're looking for that lighthouse because that lighthouse is showing them where land is. And they understand that there's rocks that are there that their ship can get caught up in. It can really be quite dangerous. And so the lighthouse is that saving force, right? And so you can imagine these sailors that they're out here, they're in this storm, in this darkness, and they're longing, they're begging to hope to see that light. Why? Because what does the light offer? Hope. It offers safety. That if I can make it there, I will be okay. You know, I get to thinking about you and I as we live this life. You know, it is the case that there are those out there in the world that they are living in a life of sin, and sadly, some of them are okay with that. They're happy to be in the world of sin. But it is also the case that there are those that are out there, they're lost in the world of sin, and they're looking and longing for a way out. And you know, it is the case that you and I have the way out. You know, you remember what it was that Jesus would do when He was here upon this earth that would often frustrate the Jews? Yes, He would heal people on the Sabbath day. Yes, He would rebuke them for their various teachings. But there was one time, and this happened on more than one occasion, but you remember He was eating with publicans, and He was eating with sinners. And you remember, well, why is He eating with them? Well, what was the purpose of Jesus? To seek and to save that which is lost. You remember a wee little man, as we sometimes will sing with our children, a man by the name of Zacchaeus. Who was he? A publican. But what was Jesus going to do that day? As we sing in that song, I'm going to your house today. There are those in the world that though they are lost in sin, they are longing to be saved. You remember in Paul's second missionary journey, he was traveling down and he come to Troas, and he's there in Troas. He has this vision, and there was a man from Macedonia saying, "Come over here and help us." In that vision, what was that man wanting help from? They were in sin, and they needed to know the truth. And what's really beautiful when you read there, it says, "And immediately they sought to travel that way," because they understood the importance of the message in which they had. That's why Paul in Romans chapter 1, we referenced verse 16 earlier, but if you go back up to verse number 13, he says, "I am a debtor both to the Greek and to the barbarian, both to the wise and the unwise. So much is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel also to you that are in Rome." Paul, why are you indebted to these men? Why is it that you're ready to preach the gospel? Because he understands that it's the power to save. He understands that there are those individuals that are in the world that they may be lost in sin, but there are those out there who long to know God and long to want to do His will. And it's up to you and I to take that message to them. Verse number 3, "Trim your feeble lamp, my brother. Some poor sailor, tempest-tossed, try now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost." You know, he says, "Trim your feeble lamp, my brother." You know, we need to make sure that we are always ready, that we are always prepared to do labor for the Lord. Trim your feeble lamp, my brother. Be prepared, because there's some poor sailor that is out there that's tempest and tossed. Look over at Matthew chapter 20. Look at verse number 1 of this chapter. "For the kingdom of heaven is likened to a man that is a householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers in his vineyard. And when he agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard." And so the kingdom of heaven, the church, is like a man that is a householder, that has a vineyard. And what is the householder looking for? What is the owner looking for? He's looking for laborers. He's looking for those that are prepared, right? I'm mindful of there in that. If you just go over a few chapters to Matthew chapter 25. There in verse number 1, you have this same phrase, the kingdom of heaven. The church is likened to 10 virgins which took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were wise, 5 of them were foolish. And they that were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And so not only do we need to be prepared to labor in the Lord's church, but we just need to be prepared. Be prepared to help anyone that we can. Trim your feeble lamp, my brother. Trim your lights. Let those in the world see your good works. Be working for the Lord. And if you need a reason as to why you need to be ready, the second part of that verse says, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost. We need to have our lamps trimmed. We need to have our lamps ready, not only because it's what God commanded us to do, but because there are those in the world that are lost. And they're looking to us. Maybe as you go about your life, people are going to know that you're a Christian because you're different. People are going to know you're a Christian by the things that you say, or at least they should know you're a Christian by the things that you say, the things that you do, and how you act. And it could just be the case that it brings about a conversation. What are you going to do if you're not prepared to have that conversation? Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse number 15, always be ready to give a defense for the hope that is within you with meekness in fear. Before that, he says, sanctify the Lord God in thy heart. So set God apart in your mind and always be ready to give an answer. Like if someone were to ask you this evening, what do I need to do in order to become a Christian? Now I understand that the apostles on the day of Pentecost were inspired. But could you imagine if there Peter and those other apostles are giving that message, convicting these individuals of their sin because they have taken the Son of God and they have crucified them with lawless hands, and these people were pricked in their hearts, and they stop Peter and the other apostles and they say, men and brethren, what must we do to be saved? And in verse 38, Peter says, I don't know. You know, when I said that, I seen a few people smile. Seems kind of silly that Peter would say that. Shouldn't. Man, we're on a roll today with kids. Get right to the climax of a point. Man, I'm doing great. Shouldn't it also be that way for us? Shouldn't it be silly when we hear a Christian say, well, I don't know how to be saved? You know, that astounds me. Some years ago, I read a survey. Some company did a survey of the Lord's Church, and they asked Christians, can you give me the plan of salvation? And I think at that point, now they polled Christians. Understand, they polled Christians. I believe at that time maybe only about, I want to say 50 to 60% of the people that they polled could give the plan of salvation. Now I'm thinking that's pretty sad. But that number went down drastically when those same people that could give it were asked to give it with a book, a chapter, and a verse. That's something we need to think about. How can I ever bring someone to Christ if I don't know where to find it? I'm not saying that you have to memorize your whole Bible. I don't have the whole Bible memorized. I'm not saying that. But you know, we should be able to tell people, hey, you need to be baptized. You should go look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse number 21. You should go look at Acts chapter 2 and verse number 38, because these things are essential. Some poor sailor, tempest-tossed, trying now to make the harbor in the darkness may be lost. There are people that are in the world that they will be lost if we don't do our job. And that's where I think the chorus of this particular song comes in. Let the lower lights be burning, send a gleam across the waves. Some poor fainting, struggling seaman, you may rescue, you may save. Brothers and sisters in Christ, as we really bring this lesson to a close, I would just have one plea for you and myself included. Let's do our job. Let's make sure that we are letting our light shine here in Olathe. You don't have to raise your hand, because sometimes we may fail at this. I think sometimes I can do a better job of this. I know I can do a better job of this, but of the neighbors that live in around your house, how many of them know that you're a child of God? I think about the number of houses on this street, and I've used this example before. If you're in this auditorium this evening and you live on Park Street, raise your hand. It's pretty daunting, isn't it? For those of you that are sitting in the front, nobody raised their hand. There's people on our own street, just this house right here, that are lost. I write this lesson for me just as much as I write it for you. I need to do a better job. We need to do a better job. Let the lower lights be burning. And with the plea to let us do our job, I would leave you with an illustration that's given in Ezekiel chapter 3. You can also find this in Ezekiel chapter 33. But it's where Ezekiel is called to be a watchman for God. And basically, if I were to sum that up, because it can be a lesson in and of itself, and we certainly don't have time for another lesson, although we could go till midnight, that's biblical. But basically, God tells Ezekiel, the purpose of a watchman, he's there and he's guarding, and when he sees danger coming, the watchman has a job. You blow the horn, and you let the people know that danger's coming. And understand, watchmen, if you blow your horn and the people are warned and they do what's necessary to save their lives, that's great. You've done your job. But also understand, watchmen, sometimes you're going to blow that horn, danger's going to come, and people aren't going to react and they're going to die. Watchmen, you've done your job. They had a choice to make. But watchmen, understand, if you see that danger coming, and you don't warn the people, he said those people are going to die, but the watchman's going to be held responsible. And so then God then illustrates that to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, you are the watchman for Israel. You need to tell them that danger is coming. Now, if you tell them, Ezekiel, and they change, that's great. Ezekiel, if you tell them and they don't change, they're going to perish, but you did your job. But Ezekiel, if you don't tell them and they perish, you know what God told Ezekiel? Their blood I will require at your hand. In other words, Ezekiel, you are going to be responsible because they died. You know that application is true to you and I today. We have the warning that sin separates man from God, and if man doesn't do something with that sin, he's going to die and going to be eternally separated from God. We can warn people about that. Now, if we warn people about that and they change, that's great. It is the case we're going to warn some people about that. They're not going to change, and sadly, they're going to be lost. But if we know that this individual is in danger of losing their soul, and we don't warn them, and we know the truth, that's on us. We're going to have to give an account for that. Sometimes we sing that song, "You Never Mentioned Him to Me." You know, that's a song that don't get requested a lot at singing. You never mentioned Him to me. You met me day by day and knew I was astray, yet never mentioned Him to me. I pray that that is not ever said about you and me. And if it can be said right now, that's sad, but guess what? You can change. I can change. We can go forward, and we can never ever let that be said about us again. We can let our lower lights be burning. If you're here this evening and you're not a child of God, we encourage you to do what's necessary to become one. If you are here this evening, you are a child of God, I pray that you're letting your light shine bright. But if it's the case that you're not, if it's the case that you've hid it, if it's the case that you've let Satan blow it out, light that fire again this evening. Repent of your sins, confess those things, pray to God, and ask for forgiveness of those sins. If there's anyone here this evening that needs to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come as together we stand and we sing.